Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar, which will be featuring the story and the history of Sikhs in Singapore, especially the Sembawang Naval Base area. This webinar is being held in conjunction with the Indian Heritage Center Sikhs in Singapore, a story untold exhibition, which opened in March 2021 and will be extended, we are happy to say, until the end of January. So we are very delighted to have some of the keen supporters of the exhibition with us this evening to speak with you. And I will be shortly inviting the moderator for this session, Simranjit, to be leading the session. But before that, just a very quick introduction to Simranjit, who has been very instrumental in the making of this exhibition. Simran is the CEO of Guardant Health Asia, Middle East, and Africa, a cancer diagnostics company. He has 15 years of senior management experience in Asia Pacific, working with biopharma, diagnostics, and medical device companies for their R&D, business expansion, and growth strategies for the region. He also sits on the board of the Oversight Committee for the National Health Innovation under the Ministry of Health. His passion for movies has allowed him to be involved as an associate producer for a Hollywood film, Hotel Mumbai, and as an executive producer for an award-winning documentary, The Saint Soldier, the story of the first Sikh in Singapore by Maharaj Singh Ji. Simran is an active volunteer and a well-known face in the Sikh community and currently serves on the Central Sikh Gurdwara Board as well as the Sikh Advisory Board in Singapore. Simran, with that, may we please invite you to take over as moderator for this session and introduce the speakers for this evening.
Thank you so much, Nerlina, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to another webinar in the series. Today, we're going to be talking about life at the Singapore Sembawang Naval Base. And we are very delighted to have pioneers with us to share stories about their life at the Sembawang Naval Base. Today, we have with us, firstly, Mr. Charanjit Singh, Lieutenant Colonel retired Charanjit Singh. He's a first generation local Sikh. His father came from Punjab to Singapore in the late 1930s and served in the British Naval Police Force. Charanjit Singh retired from the Singapore Armed Forces after 30 years of service. He then worked for 17 years at the Defence Science and Technology Agency. He's an active member of the Singapore Sikhs and has been participating in community affairs for over 3 decades. His notable service for the Singapore Sikh community includes his appointment as the government rep at the on the Sikh Advisory Board from November 1989 to November 1995. He was also the chairman of the Yishun Sikh Temple Building Committee and was instrumental in fundraising for the Sikh Temple. He also served as the president of the Singapore Khalsa Association from January 2010 to April 2016. Thank you and welcome, Mr. Charanjit Singh. Our second speaker today is Mr. Ranjit Singh. And Mr. Ranjit Singh has a very fascinating history with the Singapore Naval Base, as well as some of the key areas of his life and how his family was living at the naval base, and he will share some of that anecdotes during this discussion today. His dad came to Singapore in the early 1940s. He got a job as a policeman at the Royal Naval Police, and in 13th September 1945, he then, after the war, returned to Punjab and brought Ranjit Singh and his mom to Singapore in the early 1950s. When they came to Singapore, they stayed at the naval base and they were allotted accommodation at Riman, which is apparently a very desolate and inhospitable place. And he will share a little bit more about how that place was eerie and imposing and the difficulties during that time. He worked as a teacher at Canberra School, and very interestingly, just before the separation was posted to Labuan in Sabah, and was interestingly in Sabah during the separation between Singapore and Malaysia. So interestingly, he was a Malaysian citizen as he was in Sabah, and then when he came back to Singapore, he became a Singapore citizen at that point in time in 1967 when he returned to Singapore. He also served actively in the Sikh Education Foundation from 1991 to 1997 and retired from teaching after 36 years in the Singapore Education Service in May 1993. Welcome, Mr. Ranjit Singh. Lastly, we have Mr. Sarban Singh. He arrived with his family in Singapore in 1941, and very interestingly came to Singapore from train from Ludhiana to Calcutta, and many of them at that point in time came from Calcutta by ship to Singapore, and I'm quite sure he'll share some of that stories later on as well. He arrived in Singapore, and his father worked at the Admiralty Naval Police Force. He was here during World War II, and spent a lot of his family was staying at the naval base and spent a lot of time in that space, and experienced the war at a young age in the naval base itself. He's also a teacher and has served in the teaching service for more than 40 years and retired in 1997. Welcome, Mr. Sarban Singh. So today, we'll have all three of them share stories about the Singapore story about the Sembawang Naval Base and live in the Sembawang Naval Base. There is a question and answer tab right at the bottom of your screen, and do feel free to put in your questions as they present through and guide us through this webinar. We will take the questions right at the end of the session, and I hope that you will enjoy the session and feel free to keep it as interactive as possible. With that, without further ado, let me invite Mr. Charanjit Singh to start the presentation. Mr. Charanjit Singh.
Okay, thank you, Simran, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody, and Sat Sri Akal to all my Sikh friends who are listening in. I'll first start with where the naval base was. Can I have the next slide, please? This is where the naval base was located. I'll go through some of the areas so that you can be orientated to where this place is in relation geographically to the rest of the world. If you look at the extreme left of the screen, there's some road jutting out. That is the causeway, which is presently still there. And naval base, if you remember, was a fenced area. Okay, and the boundary is shown in the south portion of the map. And access to the naval base was actually through various gates. And the key gates were these. Number one, Rothnam Gate, which was on the west of Admiralty Road West. The second gate was Sembawang Gate, which is not on the screen. You can't see the arrow. It's on the complete right of the screen. The third gate was, third gate was Sembawang Gate. The second gate was Mata Gate. And the other gate, number 5, was Canberra Gate. 2 areas or 3 areas that I need to orient to also is to number 2, which is where Rimmel was located. Number 6, where the Asian quarters was. Basically, this was the location where most of the workers who work in the dockyard or in the naval base area resided. And number 7 is Cochrane Crescent, where the police force employees live. All right. As I mentioned earlier on, entry to the naval base was through a pass system. Anybody over the age of 12 years need to have a separate naval base pass in addition to his national identity card. And any visitors to the naval base had to come through these gates, exchange their pass, and then come and visit whoever they wanted to visit. Okay, shall we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, this is Canberra Gate. Okay, this picture I took off from one of the Naval Base WhatsApp groups, and thank you for allowing me to use this picture. This is an idea of the gate. The policeman on the left actually controls all vehicle access. All pedestrians and cyclists go through the gate, which you see on your extreme right. The point of interest is at night, after midnight, the gates are actually closed, especially the vehicular gates. And any vehicle coming in, that only then they open the gate. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the area we'll be focusing on subsequently. This is Rimmel. This picture was taken in May this year by my golfing buddy, Ranjit Singh. Okay, the interesting area there is the Rimmel Porch. This was a location where most activities took place. Example, change of shift of police personnel. You know, there were 4 shifts in the police force then, you know, 6 to 12, 12 to 6, and it went around in that order, except during the month of Ramadan, where the shifts changed to accommodate people for their fasting needs and to break fast. Besides that, this was also the activity area where off-duty policemen used to play card games. Another interesting point I witnessed in this area was when I lived there for a short while, this was also the area where our fathers got their pay. And it was a form of a parade where the pay was given to the policemen. After that, somebody checked the pay, and then they left the place. Next, please. Okay, this picture is of the Naval Police taken somewhere in 1941. Okay, my father is hidden here. He's on the right. This is from my family album. There are 2 or 3 people I can identify here. My father is on the right, extremely left, right. He's hidden. The one sitting, Sikh gentleman sitting on down there is Mr. Dalip Singh, who later became an inspector. And this was the uniform of the policemen then, before the war. And over the years, the uniform actually evolved. And I'll go through some 2 or 3 slides to show how this uniform evolved, and also how the policemen here, including my father and this Dalip Singh seated down here, grew in size. Next, please. Okay, this picture was taken in the late 40s after World War II. Mr. Dalip Singh, who was seated there, is on the extreme right of the picture, and my father is the second from left. Okay, if you notice, the uniforms change a little bit, and also the turbans change somewhat. Next slide, please. Okay, this picture is from Mr. Ranjit Singh. This is his grandfather, Mr. Taram Singh, and this was the picture of the police force towards the end until it was disbanded. If you note, the turbans of the Sikh policemen changed. Even the rank insignia, instead of being cloth, was actually metal rank insignia. And the most important thing is they had their police numbers pasted on the right breast pocket to identify themselves. Next, please. Okay, this is another picture, but this is the other people who work in the naval base who were in uniform service. These were the firemen. Although there was a big fire department with many Malays, mostly Malays, I would say, but there are 4 or 5 Sikhs. And the most interesting point is the most senior Asian officer in this group was a Sikh who is seated there, and his name was Mr. Jagtar Singh. This picture has been provided by his son, Mr. Kulwan Singh. Okay, before I go on to next, I need to mention that Sikh policemen enjoyed 2 important perks. Number 1, they had the benefits of getting pension after they retired from the force. Secondly, after 4 years of service, they were entitled for paid leave all the way back to India. This not only included the policemen themselves, but it also included the families, including all children under 18 years of age. Okay, I can remember 2 such trips, although one was done in 1957-58 when I was very young. I can't, actually recall detail, but I remember the other trip that we made somewhere in 1961, December 15, I remember the date. And we came back in April 1962, 4 months away in India, 4 months of not going to school. Okay, and the trip was always by ship from Singapore to Calcutta, and Calcutta by train all the way to your village. And somehow or other, the Sikh policemen loved to go back to their homeland because that's where their roots were. And the interesting point was whenever Sikh policemen went for such long leave, the issue was before you go for leave and once you come back from leave, your meals, how are they going to be catered? Because you don't buy rations and all until the last day. So it was a common practice in naval base then that whenever somebody was going on leave, 1 week before going on this long leave, they will cut all their dry ration supplies, and food used to be catered by friends and neighbors. Likewise, when they came back, the same arrangement followed. And this practice continued until the force was disbanded. Okay, beside this uniformed personnel, there were also other Sikhs deployed at the naval base. And I must mention that many of them came to Singapore then because most of them were staying in East Punjab then, and most were in the agricultural fields. Being in agriculture, the land bank was scarce. You couldn't afford to buy any more land because you didn't have the money. And furthermore, whatever land you have was always being subdivided among the family. So it was a shrinking resource. So this was something that compels Sikhs in Punjab actually to move on. Many came to the naval base for a simple reason. This is my guess. Is because their jobs were aplenty. The base was just being opened, and there were many vacancies available. And most of them joined actually the naval police force at its peak in somewhere in 1950s. There were about 186 officers serving in the naval base police, and they were the majority compared to the other civilians. Okay, beside this, there were also civilians, and the civilians in the naval base mostly work as drivers, electricians, or even seamen. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a photo of a seaman which came from our family album. This is Mr. Jora Singh. He had 3 of his other brothers who were also working in the naval police, in the naval base. 2 of them were police officers, and 1 was in admin duties in the naval base area. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another example of friends who were in a temple in the naval base. This was located in present-day Khalsa Crescent. Okay, the name Khalsa Crescent came about because most of the Sikhs staying there at that time had stayed at RNTD, Royal Naval Torpedo Depot. Okay, and the Sikhs, based on the story narrated by my father, he said that they wanted the name to be called, the place to be called Khalsa Crescent. That's why it got its name. Likewise, there were many Pakistanis who were staying on the other side near where Sembawang Gate was. And if you know a little bit of the history of Singapore, there is still a road called Pakistan Road, and that was to actually honor the Pakistanis who were staying at that place. Okay, with this picture there, I would also like to state that many families who live in the naval base, especially the naval police, they were actually living as a single community. There was very little interaction with the other races, and I can tell you for sure, I can speak for my mother herself, Beside Punjabi, she couldn't speak anything else. Very little Malay. She only picked up later. But the case was different from the other Asian Sikhs who stayed in Asian quarters because they had Malay neighbors, they had Chinese neighbors, and they had South Indian neighbors. And I can give you one good example of a family that was very proficient in speaking Tamil. And this probably belonged to the late Baba Ganda Singh. Baba Ganda Singh happened to be one of the priests at the Sembawang temple then. Most of his children were very well versed in speaking Tamil. In fact, one of his sons, the late Mr. Chatar Singh, was so good that when we had an opening, a groundbreaking ceremony for the Shironjit Singh temple in somewhere in 1995, the TV crew wanted somebody to talk about the significance of the ceremony at the Shironjit temple in Tamil. And we got Mr. Chatar Singh to speak. He spoke Tamil so fluently that everybody was surprised that a Sikh could speak so good Tamil. As I said, beside this, for the Sikh families that actually stayed in Riman or even mostly Riman, the interaction among the mothers, especially with other races, was not that great. But for school-going children like us, we had no issues because we had Chinese friends, we had Malay friends, we had Indian friends. And I was acknowledged that we were lucky to be in schools that had a good mix of Malays, good mix of Chinese and Indians. And there was no issues at all interacting with this group of people. With that bit, I will now go on and hand over to Ranjit to talk a little bit on the life in Riman. Ranjit, please.
Thank you, Charanjit. Srikal to all. Now, I moved to Riman in December 1950, just after we had come down from India. Now, when we arrived there, we found the place quite desolate and not lighted, quite imposing, dark building all around. It was a bit uninviting. So anyway, there was no other issue. We couldn't resist anything. We were 2 or 3 families. One was Mr. Kundan Singh, PC 69, our friend Palwan Singh's father in the family. Then myself, my father and mother. And afterwards, we had Sardara Singh, Sergeant 8, who became an inspector. And then PC 147, Natha Singh and his family. So the place was dark, the corridors were dark, but within weeks, this was lighted. The place was quiet, as I mentioned, uninviting. All around there was eeriness. And anyway, we had to survive in that situation. But after some time, more families started arriving. And life became a little bit happier. And again, people who arrived, they brought their wives, newly married, to that place. And this went on for almost 2 years. And then I moved on to RNTD. That was in 1952. And by the time I was already in school, Standard 5. But after some time, we began to have our new friends, especially Sarban Singh, Kirpal Singh, Mahinder Singh. Then we had Naginder Singh, and some of the policemen who were young guys. And we organized teams for playing hockey, netball, volleyball. And we started attending the Gurudwara under Block 5. And later on, when in 1954-55, when Guru Gobind Singh's birthday was being celebrated, there was a very large celebration. This gentleman on the left side, Mr. Karnal Singh, PC 78, he exhorted all of us, the youngsters, to do some seva, to do some work. And he organized this and started buying things, and he encouraged us to cut paper. And in his block, it became a kind of a workshop. All kinds of measurements were being done. And then even the little youngsters wanted to join in. After a period of time, especially towards the end of December, we were all ready with this arch. And this a piece of our great job having been seen by everybody, because it took a lot of time to paint the work, to put it up, to cut paper, to do all these things. Everybody used to come down and watch what we did. And probably we became a kind of an inspiration for other youngsters. So a lot of seva used to be done. Well, most of the time, the funding was done by Mr. Karnal Singh. He was our chief, he was our organizer, and he was our gentleman who helped us to encourage and become the Sevadas. And that was our beginning to get to the Gurudwara's teachings. And that is what I have to say about that life. And our friendships, long-lasting friendships, actually began in those years. Thank you.
Thanks, Ranjit. Next one, we will ask, I'll ask Sarban to discuss briefly life in Cochrane Crescent, which was also a place where a lot of naval police Sikh families resided. Sarban, please.
Okay. Towards the end of 1958, a new police quarters were being planned for the Royal Naval Police Force, just outside the dockyard main gate. The new complex comprised of six blocks of 3-storied apartments. The complex was named Cochrane Crescent. Each apartment comprised of 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a toilet. These were the best quarters ever built for the police force. Hitherto, all quarters had communal baths and common toilets. The original plan was to allocate these apartments to the families from Rimmel and Pakistan Road, but eventually very few of the Malays and Pakistanis took their allotments, and the place ended up with more Sikhs. I used to stay in Cochrane Crescent. There was no form of organized entertainment of any sort. The British sailors used to play hockey at the sandy pitches. Some of the boys took to playing hockey. Once in a way, we used to go to the Naval Base cinema to catch a show. The tickets used to be 50 cents and $1. The best part of the deal was that there was no rent to be paid. it was rent-free. We did not have to worry about paying the rent at the end of every month. Even water and electricity was absolutely free. I have an anecdote here. Once there was a strike by the civilian workers who used to collect rubbish in our place. This was the first time that the British sailors were deployed to collect rubbish. It was a real, very unusual sight for us to see the white people collecting rubbish from our dustbins. Okay, that's all I think.
Thanks, Sarban. For the next subject, I'm going to discuss some of this, basically the Sikh temples in the Naval Base. Okay, wherever the Sikh community was concentrated in the Naval Base, naturally a temple sprang up. First temple, as I mentioned, was in RNTD. I think Ranjit has covered it a bit. And this is the arc leading to the RNTD temple. A point of interest is that all members of the Naval Police Force, it was compulsory for them to be members of the Sikh temple. And point of interest is also that the subscriptions for the temple varied according to rank, and these were collected on the payday itself. Remember, I told you about the porch in Riman. People collect the pay is checked, and the next station is for you to pay your subscriptions, depending on your rank. All right. The other issue is the temple management committee. Although the management committee was by and large elected by the members, but the president of the temple was always appointed by the chief police officer, and he always happened to be the most senior Sikh officer serving in the NPF. So most of the time, these were inspectors, and people who have served there included inspectors like Inspector Angad Singh, Inspector Bhagat Singh, and so on. The temple moved wherever the police officers moved. Example, initially the temple was in RNTD of Khalsa Crescent, and somewhere in 1958-59, it moved to Rimmel. Before that, Ranjit, do you have anything to add to the arc?
I don't have much to say anything, because this was done during one of the festivals, Guru Gobind Singh's birthday. But as for the other activities that were, we youngsters were involved, were like preparing the langar, helping the ladies to be awakened in order to bring them down to the langar area so that they could prepare rotis and the other cookery work that was being done. So then we also used RNTD Gurudwara for learning our scriptures and also Punjabi, and did the seva, like for example, even prasad kisi nu dena hove or whatever, we did that, and even started looking after the garden outside, which was just in the vicinity. Then we had other activities like cleaning the tables, the Sifa Langar, especially on the Vaisakhi function of Guru Gobind Singh's birthday. And that's what we did. And then we organized hockey games in the open area. And this is where we all became very good friends. A lot of cooperation on all that basis. And we were very lucky to have a library in the guardroom area, where a lot of historical books, Gurmukhi Punjabi books were there. And people who could read Hindi, well, they also could read the books And this was something interesting.
All right, thanks, Ranjit. We go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, the temple moved whenever the naval police officers were moved. And I remember in 1958, actually, most of them moved from Khalsa Crescent to Riman. And this is a picture of the official opening of the Rimmel Temple on 1st December 1959. This picture has been again provided by Mr. Ranjit Singh, grandson of Mr. Taram Singh. If you note, everybody there is a close-knit community, all Sikhs, all wearing strict adherence to the faith, that is beard, turban, and whatever not. And I must say that at one time, Naval Base was well known for respecting and complying with the tradition of the Sikh religion. And it's a fact that not even a single member of the Naval Police Force shaved his hair or his beard or wore a hat. Everybody was fully fledged and put on a turban. The temple was actually the center, as Mr. Ranjit has said, for preaching Sikh religion, teaching moral values, and extra. Another important aspect of the Sikh temple was the temple priest or Gyaniji. Okay, I remember Gyani Pritam Singh, who is seated here somewhere, unfortunately I'm unable to point. He was also charged with teaching the Punjabi language and scriptures to us. In Rimmel, there was a class where we used to attend Punjabi lessons. Okay, and this happened to be our kindergarten years. This is where we acquired our ability to read and write Punjabi. And Punjabi was essential, as I mentioned earlier on. Our mothers did not understand any other language, and the main language of communication within the family and the neighbors when we were at home was Punjabi. English was seldom used, unlike it is today. Okay, beside this, we were always taught moral values, respect elders, and it was customary for us young children especially, whenever we saw a Sikh gentleman, to raise our hands and wish them sasrika. Otherwise, many people took offense, And the parents and the families were so well knit that actually everyone acted as first generation CCTV cameras, in that sense that whenever any child did anything wrong, the report immediately went back to the parents. I can remember this for sure because my father never asked any questions. The moment a complaint is lodged, he'll give you 2 slaps first, then you answer. That was the discipline that we had there. Among the main religious activities that took place in temples was the Vaisakhi program, which was very, very well organized and well run. And the people who performed the prayers, it was 48 hours continuous reading of the Bible, were the policemen themselves. And the arrangements were made for them such that they were on their shift duties were organized such that they could do their rotation to do the reading of the Guru Granth Sahib whenever the turn came. And on Vaisakhi day itself, in the evening, there always used to be a poetry competition, a competition of kirtan amongst the folks that stayed there. I can remember one incident down here where my father was a judge. And after the poetry competition, there was some hula balu because the person who became second was very unhappy. He didn't want to go and take his prize. So ultimately, I don't know how this issue was resolved, but what I stress is this, that everybody was very serious. Everybody thought they were good and wanted to be always the best. Okay, I'll move on now to next item. This is about education and personal ambitions. As I mentioned, most of our mothers receive little or no formal education, but every parent knew the importance of education and they did not flinch on this and made sure that the children got the best education. And this was always ingrained in us to do well in school. Okay, the competition was so great that even within parents, they used to compare, how your children did, how my children did, and whatever now. And although we were lucky in the 50s generation because we started going to school in 59, I started going to school in 59, and we had 3 schools in the Naval Base neighborhood then. But my seniors like Mr. Ranjit Singh and Mr. Sarban Singh went through a different cycle altogether. And I will now leave it to Mr. Sarban to discuss why did they go to school in Johor Bahru and not in Naval Base.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ranjit. Some of us used to live in Khalsa Crescent. Nothing to do with the name. Now it's Khalsa Crescent is a drug center, but we had nothing much to do with it. Why some of us went to Johor Bahru? Firstly, it was convenient to go to Johor Bahru distance-wise. Secondly, there were no well-established schools in the vicinity of the naval base. We had to go to town. That time going to town was equivalent to going to Singapore. That's what the term we used to have for going to town. Johor Bahru was many of our Sikh families, they had friends in Johor Bahru. And some of the families were known to one another. Often I used to walk to Bukit Zara School, which was about nearly 10 kilometers away. We had to walk. Ranjit and I used to, Ranjit joined me later. And Ranjit joined me later. And then we were promoted to Johor English College, which was a premier school in the state of Johor. People, all students had to come to Johor Bahru to do their A levels in English College. First, we used to walk across the causeway. There was no immigration or passport of any kind at that time. We used to, later on, we used to cycle to Johor Bahru, Johor English College, a good distance of about 10 to 12 kilometers. Back in those days, there were no passports or anything of that sort. I think that's about all I have to say on Johor Bahru.
Okay. Thanks, Sarban. One other notable thing, as I mentioned earlier on, was this importance placed on education. I think as a Naval Basean Sikh, we are very proud to note that the first Sikh doctor in Singapore, Dr. Mukhtar Singh, who graduated from the University of Singapore then, came from the Naval Base.
Yes.
Okay, he's the first local Sikh doctor Although there were many Malaysian doctors, but he's the first local Sikh to have graduated from Naval Base sometime in 1962. Following his footsteps was another doctor, Dr. Keval Singh, whose father was Sub-Inspector Ranjit Singh Bansi. Okay, he was the second doctor who graduated
from the Naval Base.
From the Naval Base. In addition to these two doctors, there was another gentleman who was the first engineer to graduate, and he is Mr. Ajay Singh, son of late Mr. Santokh Singh. And all these three gentlemen are now residing in Australia, and they were great role models that our parents used to talk about, so that we could emulate them, do well in studies, and follow their footsteps. You know. Next slide, please. Okay, next is sports. You know, the British love for sports was well known. As Sarban and Ranjit mentioned earlier on, there were many fields available for us to go and play hockey, sometimes soccer. The only place we couldn't go to was the swimming pool. One important thing that Naval Police had was the annual sports day. It was an inter-division sports day. This photo came from some source in UK. And if you notice, these six gentlemen all here, well, you know, I don't know which year this was taken. You can see on the singlet, the division they were in. Each division represent the area that they patrolled. And one important or one other notable thing you notice is the numbers below the letters that are stated there. These are the actual police numbers. You know, example, you have 139 on the extreme left, 131, you know, next to him. And the person without the number, I know he's 251, you know, 63 on the right, and so on and so forth. Most of them actually migrated to the UK after the British withdrew. All right. And the good thing, or I would say, or the habit among Naval Police staff was when they call one by someone, they never call him by name. They used to call him by the number. You know, and I want to highlight this, that some of us still treasure these numbers. I give you my example. Those of you who have corresponded with me via email will note that I use the number 22 after my name. As Charanjit 22. 22 was my father's number, by number. You know, some people make fun of it, but by in Punjabi means brother. All right. There's another gentleman I know who uses his number. He's 82, Sapi 82, Sapuran. If you're listening, okay, that's his number. I'll cover the gentleman afterwards. So this was it. Beside NPS Sports Day, which we used to get support because our parents used to participate, we are also proud to have produced one hockey player represented the state. Next slide, please. Okay, if you find the picture below, here's my good friend, Mr. Ranjit Singh, who represented the state in hockey. And his father, Mr. Pajat Singh, PC205, was also an excellent hockey player. All right. Beside hockey, we had another good sportsman who happened to be a soccer rep, but I can't get his picture. His name was Mr. Kartar Singh, who used to umpire or used to be a linesman for all soccer, most of the soccer matches that were played at the depot ground pitches, soccer pitches. Okay, we go on next to social functions. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a picture of Dr. Mukhtar Singh when he graduated from the university. And I think I'll leave it to one of you to say where this or what happened. Sarban or Ranjit?
Yeah.
Yes, Sarban, would you like to continue? I'll compliment it. Okay, this photo was taken during the function which Mr. Charanjit Singh has just mentioned when Dr. Mukhtar Singh graduated. So this is in celebration. And you find his father, Mr. Hakam Singh, and his uncle, of course, 82, Bhajan Singh, was sitting there. And so Mr. Sarban Singh, who is right in front, next to Dr. Keval Singh. And I'm there too, on the left side, second one. And incidentally, the fourth one is the great lawyer, Kirpal Singh, who passed away some time back in Kuala Lumpur. He was studying at the University of Malaya in Singapore. And we never knew that it was he until Mr. Keval Singh pointed it out in one of the posts in our WhatsApp group. He was a great man. So,
Tiger of Jelutong.
yes, you have to say something. Carry on, Mr. Sarban.
Yeah, he was known as a Tiger of Jelutong.
Tiger of Jelutong.
Okay, thanks, Ranjit and Sarban. Okay, this picture was contributed by Dr. Mukhtar Singh. Dr. Mukhtar, I assume you're listening to us. Thank you very much. We still remember you. Okay, Mukhtar, he related to us one story when he migrated to Brisbane in the 70s, I believe. People used to ask him which village you are from. Kede Bento in Punjabi, you know. His answer was, my village is Sembawang. This was so much love he has for Sembawang that whenever he comes back here, he will never miss an opportunity to visit each of us and have a session with him over tea or any other drink. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another interesting picture of functions that used to be held in the naval base. Okay, the man who is standing upright, I'll talk about him afterwards, is Mr. Ranjit Singh, who happens to be the uncle of Dr. Mukhtar Singh, his younger brother, his father's younger brother. And the man in turban there is the chief police officer, Mr. Charters. Okay, not only our prime minister wear turbans when he comes to Sikh functions. This used to happen long ago. It was a tradition in the naval police force then. When anybody who retires, there was a party thrown for him. Number two, for some special religious occasion, there also used to be a party. And this party was always organized in naval base in Riman. And the cooking was all self-service. We didn't have what we have today. This include festive occasions like Diwali. Diwali, I can remember in Riman, the most important ingredient that used to be cooked back then was laddus, you know, the round ball laddus. And laddus used to be centrally done, packed, and then sold to whoever want to buy them. And all this was simple gotong royong done by everybody. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the man I wish to highlight sitting there and cooking, Mr. Ranjit Singh. And I must state that this picture I got at the last moment when I spoke to my good friend, Mr. Ranjit Singh, that I wanted a picture of his father cooking. The families, he activated his family, and within 10 minutes, I got this picture. This is some cooking activity. I assume it is for some wedding. The cooking is going on. At the background, the apartments you see is what used to be Cockerick Crescent. And for any function where cooking was done, you will always see Mr. Ranjit Singh, commonly known as Biasi, seated down there. All right, being involved in the cooking. Another point I want to add is, as I stated earlier on, there were many Pakistanis who were in the naval police force. And as we spoke the same language, whenever there were functions, for example, wedding, and they were invited, they were given their due share of raw chicken or raw, flour and whatever not, to cook their own meals because of their religious needs. But when it came to eating, all ate together. This was something that was, so good about the community. There was, although religious differences, but intermingling happened at that level. Okay, and basically the harmony among the races was excellent. It was typical what we call kampung spirit. Everybody worked with each other. There was no issues, and everybody enjoyed themselves. I believe this is the last slide. I got one or two other points to make, and these are regarding what happened to the naval police people and those Sikhs in the naval base after 1971. Most of them, when they were in the naval base, they were British subjects and eligible for British passport. Many of them took British passport, including for their children, those that were under 18 years old. Many migrated to the UK. Some went to Canada, some went to Australia, and some even went back all the way to India. But the majority of them migrated to UK. Okay. The beautiful thing is, although they went back, especially the UK group, when we built Yishun Sikh temple, many of them contributed money that was required to build the temple. And we are very happy with what they did. The next issue that next matter I will discuss is why all this contribution to the Indian Heritage Center, the memorial, some of the photographs that we are sharing. Basically, I can speak for myself on this, that there are a lot of photographs, personal effects that my father had. And we family members have a very good attachment. We brothers, therefore brothers of we have very good attachment for this. But I can't say that for my children. One reason is they never see their grandparents. And my aim is actually to share this as much as possible. And hopefully these exhibits that are in the Indian Heritage Center, I hope I could donate, that they are of some use to the community. Now, with that, I would like to conclude the session, and I hope I have evoked some memories of people who have stayed in naval base. We have tried to do justice to this subject, but if we have not done enough justice, my apologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Uncle Charanjit, Uncle Sarban, and Uncle Ranjit Singh. That was a really, really enriching and informative session. Lots of really poignant anecdotes and really nice and exciting stories. The one that I like the most, actually, the comment that I like and I can attest to, was the comment on Punjabi mothers being the first generation CCTVs. I think this is a trait that they pass on generation to generation, because I think still a lot of the Punjabi mothers are CCTVs. And so I don't think that has changed very much since that time. But it was a really enriching session, and I learned a lot in terms of the life during that time, and it gave us a inside look in terms of how you grew up during the pioneer years of Singapore as well. I think there are a couple of questions that have come in. Those who are joining us today, a big thank you. Lots of you have been from the Sembawang Naval Base and are joining us from different parts of the world as well. So thank you for joining us today. Please feel free to write your questions at the Q&A tab below. There are a couple that have already come in, and we will address them. We've got a good half an hour to have a discussion, so feel free to write your questions. We want to try and engage as much as possible. So as people write in their questions, let me start off and kick off. I had a couple that I thought was very interesting, and I wanted to understand a little bit more. You mentioned about that a lot of the Sikhs came in and joined the police force during that time. I was very interested to understand, was there a selection process by the police in terms of selecting who they wanted to bring as policemen? Was it a criteria or anything at that point in time? Any insights on that?
Okay, I can give you one example. I can give you of my own father. Okay, he did his matric in Punjab, and his brother-in-law was here in Penang then. So he brought my father. As I said earlier on, the naval police actually started in 1937. So recruitment was taking place, and I guess by word of mouth or something, or God knows how, they came to know that this was going on, and my brother-in-law brought my father to Naval Base. All right. And the selection process was simple. You know, who want to join? Just if I remember, my father said they were in a queue, and the person who was doing the selection happened to be one Pakistani Muslim. That was more Pakistan. It was a Muslim from India. And my father was wearing simple kurta pajama, you know, in those days, you know, coming from India. And he had his certificate in the pocket. So when the officer came around, he just took the certificate, asked him, "Are you physically okay? All right, move one side, join." That's how it was done. But later, somewhere in the 1958, there was some reorganization of the NPF, and those who did not meet the criteria were asked to leave on a forced reorganization grounds. And this is captured in a book. If you see in the IHC, there's a book that was compiled by my father. It lists all the people when they joined, when even the children were born, when they went on long leave to India, plus who left when, who retired when, including when for some deaths occurred. You know, it's written in writing.
Okay. So there is an invaluable resource, you know, for any research that needs to be done in terms of people who have come into the Sembawang Naval Base, but more important, the immigration of Sikhs into Singapore. There are a couple of questions on the chat, and so I will ask them first, and then maybe I'll ask one more question that I had, which I thought was pertinent. So the one of the questions that came from Miss Basanti. So she asked what was the life at the Sembawang Naval Base during the Japanese occupation, and she believes that the naval base was operated by the Japanese at that point in time. So how were the locals treated, and did they work for the Japanese at that period of time? So what was life during that time?
This question is best answered by Mr. Sarban Singh, because he was there and I was not even born.
Yes, life in the naval base was nothing special. Let's see here.
During the Japanese occupations,
during the Japanese occupation, we remember as small boys, we were bundled up into air raid shelters. When it's true that the Japanese ran the naval base, the police force was also taken over by the naval base, by the Japanese. And then I remember small boys, we being taken to the air raid shelters until the air raid shelters were, the siren was call for the day. So when the siren rang, all the people ran into the shelters. And then when the all clear siren was given, then people came out of the shelters. Yes, I remember very clearly a bomb that nearly fell almost about 20 meters away from my house.
Wow.
There was a very big hole in the ground, and I think there's something to remember.
Wow. So that must have been a scary experience. Wow. So there are a couple of other questions. So let me just move on to that as well. There was a question on how big was the Sikh community in the 1960s?
1960s, we had about the last number of the PC I remember was 365. We had about 365 members in the police force, and many of them had families with them. Some even had 4 or 5 children.
Right. So roughly around 200 to 300 families or so.
Yes.
Okay. This is another very interesting question. You mentioned this, Uncle Charanjit. on the policemen. That majority of them decided to move to the UK at the end when the British forces moved back. I think that was in the 1970s, 1971 or so. What happened to those who decided to stay? Did they continue in the Singapore Police Force? Were they still accorded the same benefits that they had previously?
No, because I think those who stayed, there were various reasons. I give you my example. My father decided to stay because I was over 18 years old and already doing national service. You can't break up the family. All right. And basically, they were basically retrenched, retrenched or end of what they call end of service or something like that. They were too old to be deployed in the naval police, in Singapore Police Force. Actually, many of them became washmen, then or security guards.
Right.
So none joined. But there may be others, there may be other races, Malays or some Indians. They became members of Sembawang Shipyard. Sembawang Shipyard took over the naval base and they established their own security. Many of them then joined the security service there. Not Sikhs, non-Sikhs.
Yeah.
Sikhs, I can't recall anybody because all wanted to go off and to them UK was the thing. Nobody wanted to go back to India. They ran away from there. They don't want to go back. So, yeah.
Right. This is an interesting
I
question.
recall one example.
Yes, go ahead.
There's a gentleman by the name of Ranjit Singh. He's from Khalsa Dharmak Sabha. He was a good hockey player. And on account of his hockey, he was taken by the senior police officer to the Singapore Police Force. They had a transfer. He was in the traffic police force.
Right.
Traffic department.
This is a very interesting question. So, since we are talking a lot of it about the police force, what sort of offences that were committed in the dockyard that the police force had to deal with? I mean, what were they dealing with during that period of time? And there were a couple of strikes and I think riots during that period of time. Were the force involved in dealing with those riots or strikes during the dockyard?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I will answer that. First one, naval police force was not armed at all. They never carry any arms. The only police force I think in Singapore, I don't know, maybe the world was not armed at all. Actually, offences were basic pilfering of things. I give you one good example. I was in secondary one, and one of my classmates was a footballer, well-known footballer. I hope he's not listening. Kwok Kim Song. I think many people know him. This is a small problem. Yeah. One day, he and a group of friends, they went to trespass somebody's house, actually an Englishman's house, and go and stole sugar canes. They stole sugar canes. Never mind, three, four of them. My father caught them.
I think Uncle Ji, you buka cerita here,
Quick one. No, my father. No, it's a real story. My father caught them, and they gave false names. False name. After that, when they came back to school, they had to hit me. Your father caught us. Why? Although it's simple. Okay, come back to your question. Basically, it was actually pilfering of things from the dockyard. Many people are caught for pilfering. One good example is we had this for lightning conductors. Copper in the houses, Asian quarters. People used to pilfer that and sell. So these were the little happenings. Other than that, I don't think there was any commission, no fights. Even during the 1965 riots, when there was a curfew imposed in the rest of Singapore, I think within naval base we were easy to move around, freely moving around. No big issue within the communities. So there were no fights, no fist fight, no nothing within the community.
This is an interesting question. In terms of because there were a lot of families that were in the Sembawang Naval Base, Sikh families. So the question is, how did the mothers deliver the babies? Were they going back to Punjab to deliver? Were they doing it in the JB hospitals or in the Singapore town or midwives in the naval base itself?
Okay, good. Okay, I'll answer that because I'm first born. Naval Base had two hospitals, Asian hospital, one for the guys, basically those 12 years and above, and elderly men, Naval Base Asian. And there was also a Naval Base Women's Hospital, and they had this gynecology ward within that hospital, So most mothers went there, and the doctors were actually all the Europeans, naval officers who served as doctor. But there were many others who went to JB. Okay, that's where they ran into problems after that, becoming Singapore citizens and whatever not, because they were born in Johor. So most of us, in fact, me and my brothers, both were born in Naval Base Hospital, or some were actually born at home also. I don't know who the midwives were.
Okay. All right. There are quite a number of questions on the Gurdwara, and I also had a question on that. Any idea when the first Gurdwara was built, and then the Sembawang Gurdwara was a very popular Gurdwara, and lots of history. When was that built? And there was a lot of memory around the Sembawang Gurdwara as well, and maybe some insights in terms of some of the early pioneers who established that as well.
No, that's the history on this. I will let my seniors reply. But Sembawang Gurdwara, because I wrote something earlier on the issue, it was built in 1936. Single room, then he expanded. Maybe Sarban, Ranjit, you want to add? You all know more.
Yes. Yeah. It was a single room. Then they expanded to put the whole house.
And this was
36.
And this was a Gurdwara, and there were other Gurdwaras as well. So the one that you showed, the RNTD Gurdwara and the one at Rimmel, they were in addition to the Sembawang Gurdwara, or
the police had the Gurdwaras wherever they went.
Okay.
And RNTD, as you mentioned, is also a police Gurdwara. The View Road Temple is also a police Gurdwara. So these Gurdwaras, wherever the police went, they moved their Gurdwaras there. But the Sembawang Sikh temple was a civilian Sikh temple. It was run basically by the civilians, people who Charanjit mentioned, worked as civilians, employees, electricians and all that. They were the ones who ran the Gurdwara. One example was Tara Singh Tashi, writer.
Right.
Simran, I just want to add, actually, we used to call the Gurdwaras, Andarla Gurdwara, Barla Gurdwara. Andarla in Punjabi means within the Naval Base. Barla is the one in Sembawang.
Yeah, so inside Gurdwara and outside Gurdwara. Okay, very good. Okay, so another question that was here, and some are also mentioning about a fact. I think Uncle Mukhtiar Singh, who you mentioned, is on the chat as well. He shared about that Dr. Kirpal Mansi played hockey for Singapore. So there's another, not only state level, you also have Singapore level representation as well. One more representation there.
Apologies to Kirpal if he's listening in. He's a good friend. Anyway, he's a good friend.
Yeah. I think there's another question on the relationship of because you mentioned that it's a very the Sembawang Naval Base group was a very close-knit community. Was there a relationship between this community as well as the Sikhs in the Seaport lines or in other parts of Singapore at that point in time? I mean, what was that relationship, and was there any cross linkages and camaraderie at that point in time?
I don't think so.
So it was fairly separated at that point in time.
Exclusive.
Contingent was a different thing altogether. Another identity.
Very interesting. There are quite a number of people who are recalling themselves and their memories about that area as well. And Mr. Cheng Yang's son has just mentioned that his grandmother used to live in Khalsa Crescent, Block 2, Room 6. So just in case you all stayed nearby, Uncle Sarban stayed in Khalsa Crescent as well. Maybe a neighbor there as well.
I'm at Block 4.
Okay, close by. I think one question here was, what are some of the values and lessons that you all three of you, I mean, maybe all three can answer this question as well from a personal front. What are some of the lessons and values that you have learned from the naval base community that you would like to inculcate in younger Sikhs today?
I think one of the things that we learn is first is respect of our elders. I think this was a value very well imbued in us. As I mentioned earlier on, the moment you don't say Sastrikal to an elder, he gets annoyed. That value. The number two value I want to say is, my father is Sarban and Ranjit will know. He was a very strict disciplinarian. Every Sunday, without fail, you have to go to temple.
Yes.
These are the two values that I cherish most.
Uncle Ranjit Singh?
Well, in relation to this point that Mr. Charanjit Singh just mentioned, one value which I picked up while at RNTD was that early morning when we got up, got ready for school, mother had inculcated this habit of hers into me. That is, prior to going to school, you go to the Gurudwara, Matha Tekana. And those days, we could not read any Gurbani or anything like that. And so as such, this was our prayer. And it's only after that that I went to Sarban Singh's house to go along with him to Johor through the Rotram Gate, across the causeway, walking all the way. And occasionally, we had to take a bus. And that was the only bus service that we could go by. Green Bus Company. And those were the days which are still embedded in our minds. It was a long, long journey. And by the time we reached home back in the afternoon, it was about 2:30. And that is the time when we had our lunch. So breakfast at home, lunch back at home.
Ranjit, remember another interesting thing? They had school, we had a holiday here on Sunday, and whereas we had school in JB on Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
Another problem we faced.
That was the first day of the week. So
yeah. And Uncle Sarbanji, any values that you think that you think will be relevant and should be inculcated in the younger Sikhs today?
I think Sikhi is the path. We remember getting up at 4 o'clock and walking all the way to RNTD Gurdwara, which is not much of a distance anyway, and Matha Tek there before going to school. I think these things all carry some substance along the way.
If there's still any other question, do put it in the chat. There's one more here that came in on the women, and maybe some insights into the roles of the women at that time and whether any of them were doing paid jobs within the naval base. How did they spend the days? What were some of the roles and initiatives undertaken by the women at that point in time?
I think in the main, the women basically plays the role of homemaker, upbringing the children and looking after the children. This is one value which is missing today, where both the parents work and looking after the children is entrusted to maids. It's a sad thing, but it's a necessity because things are different, Mostly that was a function. I can't recall anybody from Naval Base, working. I can't recall unless Sarban and Ranjit know somebody.
I think there's another
Yes, sir.
another thing that the ladies used to do, embroidery. I remember the ladies used to get together and they used to embroider sarane, chadra and all that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There were a lot of crafts at that point in time. I remember my grandmother used to tell the stories to me as well, that that was an important thing for them to look at, and it was a way of all the ladies coming together and gathering together and doing all these crafts, whether it's flower arrangements or embroidery, laces, stuff like that.
If I may say so, if I may say something, they used to congregate right in front of their houses, rooms in the corridor, and then they would do crochet, and they would also do some knit work. And more, I mean, like my mother, she had done this Harmandir Sahib, for example, and they were proud of that, even though it was not the best kind of artwork or piece of work, but yet they were proud of that, and they would frame it and then put it up in the house. So that is just to show that guests or visitors to see that this is what they could do. And like my mother, she would not be able to read, but she had a small keda and she would try to go through. And Karan Singh Gangawala, that kind of a keda she had. And she would go through and she would write. And then she would complain that she was not able to see well, because of the age.
Right.
And then also they would share stories of Punjab, their old people back home, how their families lived. And then the difficulties and the separation, pangs that they were going through, having been away for so long.
Right.
And these are the issues which nobody could, understand.
Right. No, fair point. And I also think that a lot of that community was actually the intelligence community for the CCTVs. So I think that's where a lot of messages were passed through as well.
I have two incidents which I can relate, but without mentioning the names. Would you like to mention first, Charanjit?
No.
One was the time when we were both, Sarban Singh and myself, coming back from school in the afternoons. Both of us were on our bikes. And it was afternoon, very hot day. Some or other, I don't know what inspired Sarban Singh to start looking into the river down below, small stream. So we parked our cars and we started looking down. And he said, there are some fish and all that, can we have a look at it? So we were just looking down when one of the policemen passed by on a cycle, and he stopped and he said, "You boys, what are you doing? Isn't it dangerous? You will fall inside there and nobody would ever know." So this is what happened. By the time we reached home, my father was already up in arms. And he said, "Where did you stop? What were you doing this?" And these are the things that we knew that old man had already given us a message. And he was none other than PC 310, Gurnaam Singh.
Oh, very interesting.
And then another one which I remember, this time I was already teaching in Canberra School. And I was living at Royal Naval Air Station. Now they call it Sembawang Air Base. So as soon as I was in the morning session, young man over 19, walking along right in front of the, I came to a Canberra gate. There was a Sikh gentleman. He stopped the car in which I was sitting And these two people were my colleagues. And I was being offered a lift back home. So this gentleman had a look at me, sitting next to a Chinese girl. He phoned my father over there, back home. And imagine when I go home, the same question he's asking, who are you sitting with? Can you tell me that? So he was so strict, and I knew that the spy cameras had worked. So these are the two incidents which I very well remember.
Very, very interesting, very interesting. And we've got a couple of questions very related to what you have just said, Uncle Ji. So Sudhir wants to ask you, what was the undercover dating situation like in the naval base between the Punjabi boys, Punjabi girls, or non-Punjabi girls, and how was that handled?
Well, we never came across a situation of that sort. We were all separated, and we were not allowed even to talk to a girl, right? And another interesting thing was, you see, we studied only in boys' schools. The only time I came to a co-educational school was when I started teaching. And then the staff used to be ladies and men. Normally, everything was on a separation basis. So I think that would answer the question relating to that.
And were there any interracial marriages?
None whatsoever.
Unheard of.
I think they were really taboo.
Unheard of.
Okay.
You can't even imagine one.
Yeah, I guess because it was a very close-knit community, so I can understand that. In terms of the girls, the children, were they given an opportunity to study at that point in time in those days? And marriages, how did that occur during that time?
During the time in RNTT Gurudwara, we never witnessed any marriage. So normally it was said that the parents took their daughters back to Punjab to get them married.
Okay.
And once they were married, they were left there. And they never came back here. And there were one or two, I think, marriages which took place in Malaya. Those days, it was Malaya, not Malaysia.
In the 60s, there were one or two marriages in Rimmel Temple. Ranjit Singh, if you remember, our friend PC 108.
Yes.
His daughter got married in Rimmel Temple.
Okay.
I remember the judge used to come and stay in the classroom. All the beds were arranged there.
Yeah, that judge would have come from Johor Bahru.
Johor Bahru, yes, Johor Bahru, yes.
And were the girls allowed to study at that point in time? I mean, were they also going to school? And
yes, young girls were going to school, and there were lots of girls whom I have taught, and now they have grown up to be young women and maybe grandmothers as well.
Right, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. There was a question about food, and you, Uncle Charanjit, I think you mentioned about laddus. What are the other specialities and dishes that were famous in the Sembawang Naval Base?
Okay, laddus is one. The other one, sakar pare. You know, koiros.
Yeah.
Candies. You know.
So mainly the sweets. I don't hear other.
No, mostly sweet bits. Really, sweet. All had sweet. I didn't hear any. Never hear. And it used to be a practice. You know, you give from one family to another the same things. And one interesting story I want to tell you regarding laddus. I remember we used to invite classmates to our house. They would say, Mr. Singh, I don't mind singing. I don't mind coming, but don't give me the round ball. I don't know eat. I don't know why they were so scared of laddus.
maybe too sweet. Too sweet.
I think some of them are very hard. They were just like stones.
That's fair. There's one more question. I think this is more for Uncle Sarban, and probably the last question that we have. Uncle Ji, you mentioned about you hiding in the air raid shelter during the Japanese occupation. Are
Yes.
those air raid shelters still around in the Rimau area? Or any idea?
I don't think so. I think I don't know whatever happened to them.
There are some,
There's one around Block 60.
Hmm.
Block 60 opposite the Asian Hospital.
Okay. So I hope. Yeah, go ahead. Uncle.
Anybody is interested in seeing air raid shelter, you can go along Bermuda Road. Bermuda Road. There are one or two there still. I used to stay along Ottawa Road, so I know that they are still there.
Very interesting. So this is a tip. So those who are the explorers among us, please do explore. We should find out about these air raid shelters as well.
Would they be safe to enter? Because there may be some creatures living inside.
Yeah. At your own risk. Okay, so with that, I think we come to the end of today's session. I would like to thank Uncle Charanjit, Uncle Sarban, and Uncle Ranjit Singh ji. Thank you so much. What an enriching experience today. I mean, I really and thoroughly enjoyed myself with the conversation and the tidbits of information and history that you have provided us today. It was really fascinating. I would like to thank all the members of the audience as well who had joined us today and participated in this webinar, and obviously IHC for putting the exhibition together, Sikhs in Singapore, the Untold Story, as well as this webinar series. Do join in again next month. At the end of the month, we have another webinar as well. And as Nalina had mentioned at the start of this webinar, the Sikhs in Singapore exhibition has been extended till the end of January. So do pay a visit to the Indian Heritage Center and see this invaluable exhibition, because it gives you a glimpse of the history and the past of the Sikhs, a visible community parcel of the Singapore's story as well. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.